Okay, so remembering for 6-1 within those notes, I explained to you that the type of factoring that you do is dependent on how many terms you're looking at. So for 6-2, we're going to be factoring trinomials of the form 1x squared plus bx plus c. In other words, they're all going to be trinomials. Okay, and these are kind of fun. It's kind of like a puzzle. So what we're going to do is we're going to end up backwards foiling, because if you think about it, when you foil two binomials together, you're going to get a trinomial in most cases. So if we go ahead to this problem right here and we want to factor it, we're going to use a method called guess and check. So we know, first of all, there's no greatest common factor. We should always look for that first. We know that this is going to factor down into two binomials. So now let's think about this. If we were to factor these two binomials together, when I do these two terms, I'm going to need an x squared. How would that happen? Well, there'd be an x here and an x here. Now, when I multiply these two terms together, that's my L. They have to multiply together to get 15. So now, here's what you have to remember. When you FOIL, you also have the O and the I. And those are normally like terms that you can combine by addition. So what you really need to ask yourself here, and listen carefully, is what two numbers can I multiply together to get 15, where those two numbers then add together to get 8? Well, those numbers are a positive 5 and a positive 3. And we have factored that polynomial. Because if I were to FOIL these out, I would end up with this trinomial. All right, let's do this one. So again, we're going to factor. Put down two sets of parentheses. There's no GCF. We're going to have an x and an x. That's easy. Now, what two numbers multiply together to get 6, but add together to get 5? Well, those numbers are going to be 2 and 3. Okay, so pretty easy so far, I hope you think. So let's go and let's do this one. Now, this one's going to be a little bit more difficult because we have to deal with some signs. So first of all, we're going to have C and C. Now, we want two numbers that multiply together to get negative 21 and add together to get positive 4. So what multiplies together to get 21? Well, 1 and 21. Is there any way to get a 4 out of there? No. 3 and 7 multiply together to get 21. Can I get a 4 out of there? Absolutely. So these are my two numbers, but one of them has got to be negative. I want to be able to add the two numbers to get a positive 4. So doesn't that mean that the larger absolute value has to be positive and the smaller absolute value has to be negative? Because 7 plus negative 3 is positive 4. So we would have C minus 3 and C plus 7. And of course, it doesn't matter what order your two binomials are in. You may have C plus 7 and then C minus 3. That's okay. As long as you have a C minus 3 in some place there. All right, let's do D. So here we go. We have an R and an R. So we want two numbers that multiply together to get negative 12 and add together to get 4. Well, let's think of what are the numbers that multiply together to get 12. Well, 1 and 12, there's no way to get a 4 out of there. 2 and 6, is there a way to get a 4 out of there? Absolutely. Now remember, they have to multiply together to get a negative 12, so one of them has to be negative, but add together to get a positive 4. So that means it's going to be a positive 6 and a negative 2. And you have unmultiplied that, factored it. If at any time you want to stop the video and try one on your own, go for it. The more you do, the better you get. So we have an x and an x. So we want two numbers now that multiply together to get negative 42 and add together to get a negative 1. Well, if you think of everything that multiplies together to get 42, your combination of numbers is going to be a 7 and a 6 because I can get a 1 out of a 7 and a 6. Don't forget, one of them has to be negative because this is negative. So I want to add the numbers and get a negative 1. That means the 7 has to be negative. So negative 7 and positive 6. Okay, so now the signs are a little bit different in F. So here we go. We still have an A and an A. So now think about this. We want two numbers that multiply together to get 50, positive 50, but they have to add together to get negative 15. Do you see where both of these numbers would have to be negative? Because two negatives when multiplied make a positive, and two negatives when added make a negative. So what are those two numbers? Well, what multiplies together to get 50? 2 and 25. Can I get a 15 out of there? No. 5 times 10, can I get a 15 out of there? Absolutely, but it's going to be negative 5 and negative 10. So we're unfoiling. Now I threw an extra variable in here on you. No big deal. So what has to be in these two positions to get me an a squared when I multiply? Well, it has to be an a and an a. So let's ignore the b for a minute. I need two numbers that multiply together to get positive 30 and add together to get negative 10. Well, 3 and 10 are going to be my two numbers because they multiply together to get 30. But if they're going to add together to get negative 13, they both have to be negative. Now, here's where that other variable comes from. Remember, I have to FOIL the L and get a 30b squared. All that means is there's going to be a b there and a b there, and that's it. All right, let's go to H. Again, none of these have a greatest common factor in the beginning. We'll have a couple towards the end that will, but none of these do. So this one has a little interesting thing. This is an x to the 4th. How am I going to split that up into these two positions so that when I multiply them, I'm going to get x to the 4th? Well, it's simple. It's going to be x squared and x squared. Not a big deal. What are two numbers that multiply together to get positive 21? And add together to get a positive 10. Hopefully you see that those are going to be positive 7 and positive 3. Now, look at I. Notice that the order is not good. Let's rearrange the order. So let's put the r squared first, keep the negative 31r in the middle, and put the positive 30 at the end. Now, why don't you turn off the video and go ahead and factor this polynomial and then come back. Okay, so we're going to put down two sets of parentheses. Obviously, we're going to have r and r. Now, we need to multiply two numbers together to get positive 30, but add them together to get negative 31. So they're both going to have to be negative, and you can see that they have to be 30 and 1. So negative 30 and a negative 1. Now, if we look at J, we go back to the fact that you should always take out a greatest common factor first. And here, there is a greatest common factor that I can take out. Do you see what they all have in common? They all have an x in common. So when I factor that out as a GCF, I'm going to be left with x squared plus 3x minus 4. Now I have this trinomial that I'm going to backwards FOIL. So I'm going to put down my two sets of parentheses. Notice how I keep the x. That has to be in the answer. We have an x and an x. So now I need two numbers that multiply together to get negative 4 and add together to get a positive 3. Well, what multiplies together to get 4? 2 and 2, but there's no way I can get a 3 out of that. The other possibility is a 4 and a 1. There I can get a 3. I need a positive 3. So that means that the 4 has to be positive and the 1 has to be negative because they have to multiply together to get negative 4. So plus 4 and minus 1. And there you go. Last one here, K. Let's take out a greatest common factor. Well, what divides into all 3 of the numbers? I'm seeing a 5 will divide into all of the numbers. And then if I look, they all have x's in common. So I take out an x, take the lowest exponent, which would be a 3. So let's factor out a greatest common factor of 5x cubed first. In this first term, I'm going to be left with an x squared minus 5. What's going to be left there? Just an x minus 6. So now I have a trinomial that I can factor. So I'm going to break it up into 2 sets of parentheses. I'm going to have an x and an x. Now I need 2 numbers that multiply together to get negative 6. Now remember, that means one has to be negative and one has to be positive. And add together to get negative 5. So your first instinct might be a 2 and a 3, but remember, only one of them can be negative. So would these be able to add together to get negative 5 if only one of them was negative? No. That would give me either a 1 or a negative 1. So my combination has to be a 6 and a 1. And if they're going to add together to get negative 5, that means the 6 has to be negative and the 1 has to be positive. And that's how you factor trinomials of the form ax squared plus bx plus c. So what is the key here is all of these, when you took out a greatest common factor, had a coefficient of 1 in front of the x squared. That's what makes it a little bit easier than what we're about to do.